Hello, hello, hello. Welcome back to my channel. I am Monet and you are watching Life is Monet. It is time to talk about some of the best books that I read in 2022 and I could not be more excited. I was just filled with joy composing this list and I'm looking forward to discussing some of them with you all. So this is not in any particular order. That would be incredibly hard for me to do. This is a mix of like series as well as like standalones. It's a compilation of books that I just really adored, would highly recommend. Some of them made my top favorites ever for a variety of reasons. Like, this is gonna be a very diverse list. So first up we have the Betrayals. Also The Binding will be on here, and just Bridget Collins as a whole. This is an author that I feel has been like missing from my life. I am so glad that I just seen her books on the shelves in the store and decided to take a chance on them. They ended up being some of like my most fun and like out of the box read this year. So in the Betrayals, we are set at this university. The university around which the book is centered is rather high society and reclusive in nature. And so we follow one character who was a part of this rising party, and this party is in the process of consolidating power, and he pisses off the wrong person. And so he is basically given the choice of like being killed or going back to being a professor at the university in which he graduated from. When he gets back to this university, he finds that it has changed in a variety of ways, and that one of the biggest things is that they now have a female professor, which is something that was not a thing when he was a student at this university because it was for men and men only. He senses this weird like familiar sense with this female character, but he has no idea like what it is or what that means. And so throughout the story, we're following the happenings of what's going on around this university, the consolidation of power, the persecution of people of other religions, other sexualities, and other races, and whether or not the university wants to get involved in that. Because if the university was to get involved with the political happenings of what's going on outside of the university, they would be losing power. Most of the political players are leaving the university alone because they know that it is rather seclusive. Even though it is powerful, it tends to mind its own business and focus on what's happening within their own walls. But if they were to push back on that, they would experience a bit of a tug of war with their power. But as it stands, there are some political players that are trying to alter the way that the university accepts students and how they conduct their day-to-day dealings. So I thought that that was just one interesting thing about the story, is that this feels like every other European country during this time period, but she has this like boundless parameter because she's created a false history and a false country, and she can kind of do what she wants while pulling from realistic and just historical things that have actually happened. I thought that the romance in the story, because it is centered around a romance, was very interesting. There was a twist in the book that I kept trying to figure out for most of the story that even I was not prepared for, but I found it to be just satisfying nonetheless. My favorite aspect about this book is that at the university they learn to play this great game, and it's very ambiguous. It is not ever explained in detail. You get all of the happenings and the practices and the effort that goes into the great game, but it's described as kind of like this artistry, symphony, magical component. You are like so interested in understanding what the great game is, but knowing that the author would never really explain it. But it feels just like it might be this amazing thing to witness and watch and create. I just really just thought that that was just a fun component and fun spin to the story while dealing with some other just harsher topics. And then we have The Binding, which is a book that I really enjoyed when I read it, but it wasn't quite 5 stars. But in hindsight, I reflect on the book more fondly, and I feel like I definitely need to give it a reread. This book felt very much like a fever dream. I also have a review of me reading both of these stories. I will link that video up in the cards. But The Binding, we're following this character by the name of Emmett, and Emmett has these blackout spells where he gets aggressive and he checks out and he's not really in control of himself. In this world, they have this taboo understanding of what it means to be a bookbinder. Bookbinders have the ability to take someone's memory and to bind it in a book within a story, and the person whose memories was used to create the book no longer has access to that, right? They're literally taking the memories from the person. And so this is seen as like this sinister thing to do, and for a multitude of reasons that Bridget Collins actually does explore within the story. And so one day Emmett gets this letter from the local bookbinder saying that she is calling on him to be her apprentice, and he really has no choice but to go, although he doesn't want to. He doesn't really understand the fear that most of the people in his village have around being a bookbinder, but he's also like kind of hesitant of like, what is it that you're doing, and like, why is it that you do this? And so as he's there learning what it means to be an apprentice to a bookbinder, and he starts to see these different people that come in, some of them are involuntarily having their memories taken, some of them are begging to have their memories taken, and you kind of just explore the impact that certain situations, especially trauma, can have on a person when they are forced to relive it. One day Emmett comes across a book within the binder's catalog that has his name on it, and it is filled with memories that he does not have access to. So I thought that this was a very interesting story. It's another just book that makes you very immersed in the story while still keeping certain things elusive. I still feel like just the clarity was not there, but it's not a complaint. I think that's such a delicate balance to write as an author, to just keep the reader strung along just enough to where they're not exactly frustrated, and they kind of like exploring this like Alice in Wonderland situation. I think that Bridget Collins does that better than anyone I've been able to see so far, but take that with a grain of salt. I know that not every reader is going to have the patience that I do. These are just books that I thought were just extremely fun to read. They still covered some very heavy topics. They still had very great twists that usually fantasy books do not rely on, but I thought that the twists in these stories were very, very interesting. So the next two books are From the Deaths of Zoe Washington and A Soft Place to Land. These two books are by an author that I am also very glad to have discovered this year. I don't read a lot of middle grade. This was actually my first year getting back into reading middle grade after like a several year hiatus, and I just love these books so much. Just the topics that they cover in a middle grade capacity, I am in awe of. From the Deaths of Zoe Washington is following a character by the name of Zoe, and she has a seemingly normal life. She has a grandmother that she's very close to, that she loves to cook with, her mother, her stepfather, pretty like balanced upbringing. But the one thing that's taboo about Zoe's life is that her biological father is in prison for a crime that really no one wants to talk about, and her mom has a very complex outlook on the decisions that her father made that landed him in jail. And so one day Zoe gets a letter from her father, and she starts to correspond with him in secret, and she discovers that he is not this big, bad, heinous person that people in her life have made her think of him. And so Zoe starts to explore this relationship with her father, and I thought that it was just so precious for her to be introduced to things that most kids are, and not really having an avenue or an outlet to ask those straight on questions because you're not sure if you're gonna get honest and just transparent answers. And so there's literally one scene in the book where Zoe wants to learn more about just the legalities of going to prison and having a court and a trial, and she just like goes to the local library, which is something that I thought was just so adorable and really touched me, because that is how I learned as a kid. I would always just go to the library and try to find books. I would spend hours of my days, especially my summer days, in the library learning about things. And when there was questions that I didn't want to ask my mom or really couldn't ask my mom, I discovered it through reading. And so there's just something that's very wholesome about the method in which Zoe goes to just try to find more answers, and also like how she brings those to her parents and her grandparents and just the adults in her life to try to get to the bottom of something that just isn't clicking, it isn't making sense for her. And those like placating childhood answers that you would give a child that you think doesn't understand, how it's time to really sit down and have a nuanced conversation, because now they're understanding that those simple answers are no longer enough. They're no longer sufficient enough. I enjoyed Zoe's relationship with her father. I enjoyed his depiction and like the exploration of his situation. And I also felt like the resolution in the book was perfect for a middle grade reader, and it's something that I feel confident recommending to young readers. And then the second one is A Soft Place to Land. This is another one that like I even feel like this one is more recommendable, especially if you don't want to cover such harder topics like prison and reform and all those things that happens in Zoe Washington. So in A Soft Place to Land, we're following this character by the name of Joy, and Joy's family are falling on hard times. Her father has lost his job. He's a very educated man, and so there's a little bit of pride around the type of jobs that he'll take, because he kind of has this sense that, you know, he did so many things right in his life. He took the steps that, you know, everyone kind of told him to, and now, you know, they're having to make concessions on their lifestyle. So I enjoyed seeing the impacts of financial instability on marriage without it being so catastrophic from the point of a child. I felt like it was very accurately done. So in the story, Joy's family decides to downsize from their house, and so they decide to move into an apartment building. And Joy is very, very upset about this because she grew up in this house. She was born in this house. She's used to having privacy and being able to make noise and run around and not having to deal with neighbors. And so there's just so many like things that throw off the equilibrium in her life when she moves to this apartment complex, and she's having a really hard time adjusting. And so she finds this kind of like room within the apartment building that kids just kind of hang out with when they want to get away from their parents. And I thought that there was just something so adorable about these kids coming together, and they're dealing with things in their life, well, things are happening in their life that are affecting them, and they really don't have a say so, right? Because the adults are making decisions for them, but they're still feeling the emotional reverberations of it. And as Joy is hanging out in this room, someone kind of writes a little sentence on the wall that they are having a harder time than her, right? They're dealing with grief and loss and depression, and Zoe starts to write this person back. And so they're corresponding by writing notes and writing on the wall in this hangout spot in the room. And Joy becomes just revitalized of like, I'm not having the best time, I'm having a hard time adjusting, but I want to do something great for someone else, and I want to find this person and help them. And so we're following Joy on that journey. And I really love these books. I think that Janae as an author has this great capacity to tell such strong, impacting stories in a middle grade way without trying to age it up, but also still covering like age appropriate topics, right? This is something that everyone can relate to, but we're seeing it from the lens of a younger audience, and I thought that it was just very well done. This is the year that I fell in love with some YAs. The next book we have is How Moon Fuertes Fell in Love with the Universe. I adored this book. It brought out so many emotions. I haven't been this proud of a character in a while. Our main character in this book, her name is Moon, and Moon is a twin, and her twin sister is just this magnet for people. She's a social media influencer, and Moon is kind of always in the background of her sister's life. She's a camera person, she's the videographer, she is just the project manager for all the things that her sister has going on. And Moon has just accepted that she would just always kind of like be the ugly sister. Not only is her sister more beloved in school and on social media, but just also between the parent dynamics as well. She's a bit of a favorite child as opposed to Moon to her mom. And so Moon is just an outcast in so many ways in different aspects of her life. And so one summer there is this big social media cross-country road trip where all these different teen influencers are going to come together and they're going to travel for this big project. And so Moon's sister is invited to participate. She really does, but her mom is like, you're not going to go unless Moon goes with you. And Moon absolutely does not want to go on this trip because she doesn't want to be reminded of just how much more attractive and appealing her sister is by comparison to her. And so as she's on this road trip, she has this kind of like nemesis by the name of Santiago. And Santiago has some very hard hitting things that he's dealing with in his life. Santiago is a sibling, and he has a very interesting dynamic between him and his brother as well. And I thought that this book was just so wholesome. The way that Moon came to love herself, right? She had to learn so much about herself before she could accept love from someone else. Not only just exploring the path or the journey to loving yourself, but starting to demand what you deserve and starting to set boundaries and expectations. And you are going to treat me this way because I deserve it. And just setting these standards for how to interact with her and how much like crap she dealt with before and how much crap she's not going to do it going forward, and setting those boundaries with friends, with family, with her sister, with her mother. It was a journey truly for her to stand on her ground. And there were so many different relationships that we touched on, even individuals that you thought would have been there for her that were really just doing these things for her out of pity without really like respecting her. I think that like the takeaways from this story is something that like I will always remember. It's a book that I want to go back and reread because even though I thought that the romance was nice and I believed in them, I was proud of them getting together in the end, I was so much more here for Moon's journey of self-discovery than I was for the romance. So I definitely feel like I need to go back and measure the romance aspect of it, because I was just like, girl, I was so proud of her throughout the story and like just being so young and discovering all these things about yourself. The next book I have is New Age of Empire. This is a nonfiction that was revolutionary at the time that I read it. We explore the lingering effects and also the new effects of like a new post-colonial world, or like neo-colonialism. One of the things that I really loved about the story is that the author is British. He's African descendant, but he's British. And so he explores so many aspects, not just from a US standpoint, but particularly how many countries especially the UK, benefited from slavery as it continued in America. And there's some explorations of where China comes into play and how we should view China as a new world player and what that means for human rights and the economies of different countries. And one of the things that I feel needs to be talked about more is slavery, not from a social or like moral ethical standpoint, but slavery from a economic standpoint, and truly understanding the economics of it and how some things weren't personal. It really was about money, and they used ethics and morals to defend their stance on money. And I was just glad to see so many books starting to talk about that in a more nuanced discussion this year, especially the 1619 Project. I thought that the 1619 Project did a great job of just not depending on, like I said, social constructs or social standards for how we should interact and how we should talk about human rights, but talking about the bottom line economy and what drove so many decisions and what came in hindsight later. The 1619 Project is a book that I would highly recommend, but it really looks on the past. And what I love and what's different about the New Age of Empire is that it takes those historical elements and draws deep and clear connections to what's happening today. True industries, specific industries that are powerful today, that are money making today, that depended upon and would not exist without their historical foundation in the involvement of slavery, even if they weren't necessarily directly involved, but involved with bearing the fruits of the labor of slavery. This is a book, it's very, very short, incredibly impactful, well researched, and there's a lot of foreshadowing, and just you can see where the author is, like where his stance is on things, which I thought was very bold, because most of the time you have authors that will write these type of dense historical fictions and they have opinions on looking back on it, but they don't make projections going forward, and they're not as transparent as I feel this author was in this book. This book was definitely the most annotated, written in, highlighted book throughout the year. I honestly feel like I need to go and get another copy because the book is like majority my handwriting at this point. So it's definitely not a book that I can lend out to someone. I thought the audiobook was pretty good. It's narrated by the author himself, so highly recommend that one. So next up we have The Name of the Wind and The Wise Man's Fear. I did not expect to enjoy these books as much as I did, and it was such a comforting read. There were so many things I enjoyed about Quoth as a main character, and the writing style itself, it has some of the best just prose that I've seen in adult fantasy in a long time. It's a book that I feel if you read it and you like it, you will really enjoy reading it. It's a story that is long, but you're happy to be there for the majority of the story. And one of the things that shocked me is that there's really no synopsis for this story. You only hear really reviews, but there's no true direction of the story without really spoiling where it's going. We're following a main character by the name of Quoth, and Quoth is someone who as a kid something traumatic happened to him, and he decided to chase down a legend for the sake of revenge, and somehow becomes a legend himself in the process. And so we see Quoth as he's older, he's living this life as a barkeep. He's not reflective of these legends and stories that are being told about him, but one day a chronicler or storyteller comes into the bar, and he's determined to tell the story of the great Quoth. And so Quoth agrees to tell his story, and so as a reader, you're jumping back and forth between like, wow, here's someone who created a legend or a myth around them while chasing down a myth, and so you're exploring whether or not these things are really true, what myths even have truth to it, what has been over exaggerated, and how you can kind of formulate something bigger than yourself or become something bigger than yourself while searching out something, if that makes any sense. I know it sounds very ambiguous, but that's really just a story. And these are two books that, like, I'm very sad that we've been waiting over 10 years for the last book to come out. I think it's a trilogy, I could be wrong, but I'm now joining the group of people that have been waiting a decade or so for the next book in this series to come out. But I do feel like I would reread book 1 and book 2 just because there's so much to like enjoy and take away, and I just found it to be a very comforting read. Next up we have The Confessions of an Alleged Good Girl. This is another author that I just have really been enjoying this year. I am like so glad that I gave YA contemporary a chance, because I was reading like YA sci-fis, YA mystery thrillers, and YA fantasies, and they were not hitting for me at all, and so I was on a bit of a hiatus from reading those stories, but something just kind of told me to try YA contemporaries, and I am so glad that I did, because I've been having a good enough time. Not all of them have been good, but I have found some gems for sure. So this is Joya's sophomore novel. I also gave their first one 5 stars as well. So if you are thinking about reading that one, I highly recommend. It's called Excuse Me While I Ugly Cry. I loved that book last year. So this was a highly anticipated read for me this year, and it did not disappoint. So in this book, we're following this character by the name of Monique, and Monique is a preacher's kid, and she has a boyfriend that her father really approves of, and her mom, and they've been together for a few years, and he really wants to take the extra step of getting involved sexually with Monique, and she wants to as well, or at least for the most part she thinks she does. But every time she tries to go that extra mile with him, something just does not work, and he's becoming incredibly frustrated with her for just being a bit of a tease, and she's desperate to keep him. She loves him, and she doesn't want him to break up with her for this situation. So when he basically gives her this ultimatum, she sets out on this journey to find out what it is about her that is preventing her from having sex. We really follow her balancing this physical apprehension to having sex with her longtime boyfriend, as well as like her mental and emotional stance. There's also a bit of a bad boy that goes to her church, so we explore a relationship between him and her, and the way her parents see her as an individual and the expectations that they have for her. I just thought that this was a great book to explore preacher's kids seeking out their own identity, but also just about a kid exploring herself, what expectations she has for herself, and who she wants to be versus who her parents want to be. I just feel like there's this added component by the fact that her father is a preacher that adds pressure or like stakes to the story, but I still think that like even without that, there's still so much to talk about here. But with that being said, there's also a lot to explore about church expectations around a preacher's kid, and who they are able to be seen with in terms of their friends or significant others and things like that. So this is very different from Excuse Me While I Ugly Cry, but it's still a YA that covered a wide variety of topics, and I can't say that I enjoyed this one more than Excuse Me While I Ugly Cry just because they're so different, right? But I gave both of them 5 stars because for what it's worth and what they do explore, I thought that they were great stories. Next up, we have Beyond Redemption. This one was fun and gory. I do think that if you're a fan of Joe Abercrombie and like the gory, gritty violence to his stories, you would enjoy this book. It's an indie publish. We are following, I can't remember, there's several characters in this book, so forgive me, I read this like in February, I don't remember their names, but there is this chosen one trope where there's this kid that has literally been shaped and molded to be this chosen one, and there's a religious sect that actually created this kid, but then there's these individuals who are kind of like bandits that are like, okay, everyone believes that this kid is going to be like the new chosen one, and there's so many like religious zealots that either want their hands on him to control the followers of him, or they want to kill him to put someone else in his place. And so these bandits come and they kidnap this chosen one for their own means, and so there's a lot to explore within the story about how these bandits interact with one another, whether or not this kid is actually a chosen one, and just religious zealousness and dedication throughout the story. I thought that this was fun, and I did not expect it to be as violent as it was. I am looking forward to continuing in the series. I think that the last fantasy book I read by an indie author was Cradle, which definitely had a bit of a learning curve before it got to being better. I think the later books in the series are better than like the first 2 or 3, but this one I thought was a very strong installation into a trilogy. Next up, we have Darius the Great Deserves Better. This is the sequel to Darius the Great It's Not Okay. We're following Darius in book 1 as he deals with being a Persian American kid that gets bullied at school. He travels back to Iran to visit his grandfather, who is very, very sick, and he discovers a relationship with a friend, and you just watch Darius explore so many topics that are like hard-hitting, that I thought book 1 was just so incredibly well done. It's a book that I really enjoyed, and I had high hopes for book 2. I was so afraid to be let down, but I absolutely wasn't. In book 1, even though it's described as like a male like queer story, I would disagree with that strongly, because while you as a reader are understanding things about Darius that he is not understanding about himself, just because you know that about a character doesn't mean that you can insert that into a story before it's time or before it actually happens. I feel like the relationship that he has with his male friend was very platonic, and I thought that it was wholesome that Darius finally had a true friend that he could call on and speak to and just kind of be open with about things that he was struggling with in terms of his mental and emotional health, his relationship with his homeland, his relationship being a part of the Persian American community, his disappointment to his father and disappointment in his father. Like there was so many like platonic things that was happening in book one that I almost feel like if you put emphasis on a romance that really wasn't developed and really wasn't there, you missed what the author was really trying to say. But that changed very much in Darius the Great Deserves Better, because between book one and book two, Darius has actually come out as a queer individual, and so we are exploring him now in romantic relationships with male partners. That like now I'm like, okay, this is, even though you knew the story was going here, it to me didn't happen until this book, but I still really enjoyed it. It covered some interesting topics again. I feel like YAs YA contemporaries are doing what I need them to do, and I was shocked and just surprised, and I think that like I just really love Darius as a character. It's very similar to like Aristotle and Dante, Discover the Secrets of the Universe. I've only read book one in that, but I feel like I definitely prefer Darius the Great Is Not Okay over Aristotle. That might be like a nebulous opinion. I don't know. This is my first time saying that out loud. So if you strongly disagree, like, don't attack me, because I know how you girlies like to tussle, but I prefer Darius the Great. Okay, and then the next and last YA that was a slap and a banger for me this year is The Lesbian's Guide to Catholic School. Oh my god, this book was so fun. I love Yamilet. We're following a Mexican American character again, like we did in Moon Fuertes, and I actually like would just recommend both of these books. They were just such great representation. So Yamilet is an older sister to a brother that often gets in trouble, and her mom has high expectations on Yamilet, but also expectations for her to keep her brother in line, and he's kind of like, you know, he's the boy of the family, he's the youngest, and so he gets babied in a way that Yamilet doesn't, and so Yamilet has to go to this private school, even though she's not really like the smartest, but her brother is, and she's there to kind of keep an eye on him. She is also queer, and she was outed at her last school, and that was a very like complex and just traumatic experience for her, and so she's determined to stay in the closet at this Catholic school, which is a lot harder to do at a Catholic school. It's hard to be in the closet, period, but I think it's harder to do at a school that has so many foundations of faith and rhetoric that aren't in alignment with you. And so there's a lot to unpack here. I don't want to give too much away about this story because I feel like it would kind of spoil, but this is another one where Yamilet is going to have to explore a very complex dynamic with her mother and also with her brother, and her mother is very, very religious. She strongly believes in Catholicism, and Yamilet is almost convinced that her mother will not accept her if she was to find out that Yamilet is queer. Man, the explorations and journeys of self in both of these books, Moon Fuertes and The Lesbian's Guide to Catholic School, was utterly amazing. Like, I'm so proud that there are books on the market for younger individuals that explore topics in a way that it should be explored, that doesn't self-insert from the author, doesn't try to drive the readers in one direction or another, but just tells a story that individuals can relate to, that they can see themselves in, and let the characters make decisions for themselves throughout the book. Next up, we have What My Bones Know. This is a nonfiction. It's a self-autobiography as well. This author was diagnosed in the early 2000s with complex PTSD, and so we kind of explore what that journey was for her before there was as much research around complex PTSD as there is today. And by that, I say like that very loosely because there's still not a lot. But at the time, PTSD was the general term that was used. And so she was diagnosed with a subset or a version of PTSD that was not as well known, that severely impacted her. And it was interesting to follow her story from being a child and how she was raised and how many components contributed to the development of this disorder. I think that one of the strongest components to this book is her descriptions of how it impacts her. I'm so glad that an author like this book is own voices, because I don't think that it's possible to convey in such a clear, distinct manner of how this particular diagnosis impacted her. Like, it felt very vivid. I felt like I was experiencing these things with her, and it evoked so many emotions and just tolerance, patience, empathy, passion, and understanding for individuals who deal with PTSD in general, but also just complex PTSD, and being a part of a small pool of people that are all like, okay, well, we have the diagnosis, but there's not the resolutions, right? There's not the science and the research and the pills and the prescriptions. It's like, okay, like we are on this journey and we're like this inaugural class of something that like doctors are still trying to work out. They're still trying to figure out best practices of handling these situations. And so I just thought that like, wow, it's a book that made me think, wow, like I can't imagine what it feels to deal with something that is at the time a rarity, or at the time not as well known as other diagnoses. And so you have limited options, but it is impacting your life tremendously on a day-to-day basis. The book is so beautifully written. The audiobook is done by the author. Even if you're not someone that thinks complex PTSD or PTSD in general is something that you would be interested in, I still recommend it because it really opened my eye up to like the world. I think it was a great book. Moving into the next genre that I really explored this year and kind of loved. I've been trying to read thrillers here and there, but I haven't like found like my favorite thriller besides The Push by Ashley Audrain, which was like a psychological thriller. But I wanted to read like some of the cult favorites and like read authors and like just popular individuals that write within this genre. And I discovered some favorites, one of which being Karen Slaughter. I truly enjoyed Pretty Girls and False Witness. I think that False Witness might be my favorite of the two, but I still highly recommend both. So False Witness centers around a character by the name of Lee and her sister Callie. When they were younger, something catastrophic happened and they had to lie and like cover up this event. And so 20 years later, we're following Lee, who has kind of established herself as a defense attorney. She has a beautiful daughter that's healthy and in school. She's going through a amicable divorce and like she's having like really a normal life. So one day she gets called in to defend a man who was accused of a very brutal rape. And so she soon realizes that he purposely selected her to be his defense attorney because they have a connection to each other, to this past event, and she's not exactly sure why or how. He knows her deepest and dark held secret, and she has to balance between defending a man that was accused of one of the most brutal crimes that she's seen in her career, while being kind of like blackmailed due to something that happened in her childhood that also will tie in her sister, who has been struggling to deal with the situations that happened when they were younger, and she's trying to protect her kids, her ex-husband, her sister, and also the victims of the situation, but her hands are kind of tied throughout the story. I truly enjoyed this book. Karen Slaughter writes thrillers that like could be dramatized easily. I think False Witness might be my favorite because it was just like heart-thumping, action-packed, like jaw-dropping, amazing, fantastical, like loved it. Okay, 5 out of 5 stars. So the next book is Pretty Girls, and that is a close runner-up to being like just under my favorite book by Karen Slaughter. We are following Claire and Lydia. These are two adult women, and when they were younger, their sister Julia went missing, and it's become a bit of a cold case. No one knows what happened to her at all, and it's something that has always impacted their family and also the parental dynamics and the relationship between Claire and Lydia themselves. And 20 years later, after their sister Julia went missing, another girl has gone missing in the neighborhood, and Claire is convinced that this has some connection to her sister Julia going missing 20 years prior. She's just not exactly sure. And as the story unfolds, you discover that it has a lot more than just a connection to the disappearance of Julia. It has a deep and personal connection to the sisters themselves, and they are more closely tied to these girls that have been going missing over the last few decades than either of them are aware of. This is another one that was very dramatized. I could easily see it being like a limited series or TV show, movie on Netflix or something like that, because this felt like very visual of like a drama. Like, I don't know. It was just such a fun and fast-paced read. I highly recommend Karen Slaughter books if you want a similar book to that, but these are two like of my favorite thrillers. Another one that I read and kind of enjoyed again would be like The Good Daughter, but though that one's not up there with False Witness and Pretty Girls. If you have read a bunch of Karen Slaughters and you have a recommendation for me based off of that, please leave them in the comment sections below, because I want to return back to that era where I was reading those books and having the time of my little life. The next book that ended up being a favorite mystery thriller for me is going to be The Night Swim. I did not expect to love this book as much as I did, but this solidified like podcast like stories for me, because now I've just been reading them like ever since I read this book. We're following this character by the name of Rachel. She does kind of like a true crime podcast, and the first season of her podcast kind of like became an overnight sensation, especially because her investigation led to the release of an innocent man who was wrongly convicted of a crime. And so now everyone is deeply awaiting her next season of her podcast, and she's usually known for like her voice in her episodes, but definitely not for her face or the way she looks, because she's just a voice behind a mic. Like, no one's seen her until one day she gets this letter of someone who directly targeted her and leaves a letter on her car identifying her as the podcast host. And she's a bit shooken by this because like, hello, how do you know me? And this individual is like relentlessly trying to get Rachel to investigate the murder of their sister that happened about 20 years ago. I think it's been about a decade or 2 years ago, and her death was deemed an accident because she drowned. But the individual who's leaving these notes on Rachel's car and like hotel rooms are insisting that she was murdered. And from there, Rachel actually sets the next season of her podcast in this small town as she uses the clues that are left by the person who's stalking her to investigate whether or not this girl really drowned or whether or not she was murdered all those years ago. I don't feel like this one was as dramatic or dramatizing as the Karen Slaughter books, but I do think that it was a pretty strong, I think this is the debut by the author. I do think that it was a pretty strong story nonetheless. I highly recommend it if you're looking for something a little less LaFleur than Pretty Girls and False Witness, and I do think that it had a like pretty satisfying climax. I am looking forward to reading, or I was looking forward to reading more books by this author, but then their sophomore release ended up being like one of the worst books that I've read this year, and I gave it like 1 or 2 stars. So I'm really hoping, like, fingers crossed, that this was just not like a one-hit wonder and like the second book was just like an anomaly, because this one was really, really good, and I was so sad to go from a 5-star to a 1-star on Megan's next release. And then the last book that I wanted to talk about is going to be the Nevernight Trilogy. Book 1 was recommended to me by Jocelyn in a secret project blog that I did earlier this year, where she picked out my TBR. It was not a book that was ever on my radar. I never really planned to read it at all. I had read Illuminae by Jay Kristoff, which was co-written. I had read Aurora Rising by Jay Kristoff, which was also co-written. I ended up hating that one and DNFing it, and so I didn't continue at all. And then I also read Empire of the Vampire, which I was just like, okay, like, it was fine, right? I didn't love it, but I also didn't hate it. It was just like an okay book. And so I was very shocked that I enjoyed book 1 in this series as much as I did, and it also helped me understand why Jay Kristoff is as hyped of an author as he is, because having read 3 other books by him, I was not really impressed, and I was just like, wow, like, this is what all the hype is about. Like, he writes dramatic or dramatized fantasy stories with like very visual like fighting scenes, and like I guess I could see how people like that, but okay, I wasn't like that impressed. I think the book and the series overall was just the perfect culmination of like his writing style and what's good about his writing style paired with an interesting plot. And I read book 1 at like the perfect time. I was blown away. I was genuinely impressed, and I stayed that way throughout the entire series, and that's unfortunate because, you know, he's a crappy person, I've heard. I don't know much about him, but like my first introduction to Jay Kristoff as an author was just through like the stories here and there, and then I started to hear like all of the bad like perspectives and just situations that he's been involved in, and I was just like, I wasn't invested enough in his books to like read anymore. I knew that Nevernight was the like cult fave by him, but I wasn't impressed with the other stories, so I wasn't going to read this. But I have to say, like, wow, he's trash, but the writing is not. The writing is not. He's a terrible person, but the book slapped. I don't know what to tell you guys. That's the honest truth. So take that for what it's worth. I had to be honest. Those books were they were a fun time for me this year, and I'm trying to read right now The Red Sister, which is another like assassin like nun story similar to Nevernight. And it's currently not giving. It's currently not giving what Nevernight gave. I hope that it gets better as I continue with the series, but right now, it's not, honey. It's not looking too bright. I don't know how many books that is because I really did not count them, but those are my most notable mentions and favorites from this year. I do think that, like, by comparison, last year I had so many like fantasy books and romance fantasy books on my top of the year. I'm so proud of myself for like using the TBR jar this year, changing up my reading taste, reading outside of like my norm, trying out new genres, learning about myself as a reader, and discovering favorites that I probably would not have picked up on if I had not just backed up off reading fantasy. But as much fun as I had this year, as much as I love the books that I read this year, in 2023 I plan to return back to my fantasy bag, with the exception of those thrillers, because Karen Slaughter, I'm gonna keep reading from my good sis, I'm gonna be honest with you. But yeah, I plan to return to my fantasy bag and pick up on some books that I should have read this year but did not. Overall, I think that I had a pretty decent reading year. I found some books that are near and dear to my heart that just bring me joy when I think about them, and I hope that you guys had the same experience. Thank you for watching my video, and I will see you next one. Bye!